Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In this episode of Blazor Train, I'll show you how to test your Blazor apps and components with unit testing and component testing. Now, testing is a big topic, so we're going to start slow. This week I'll focus on unit testing and component testing, and next week we'll get into end-to-end testing. We'll create tests that run your app and manipulate the browser elements. But that's next week. For now, we're going to focus on unit tests for your code and for your Blazor pages and components. And that's coming up right now, right here on come on, help me. Blazor Train! Okay, we're going to start with a little history lesson. In the beginning, there was NUnit. Actually, before NUnit, there was JUnit, which was a Java-based unit testing framework and test runner. And then it was ported to .NET and called NUnit. And for years, we've been talking on .NET Rocks about NUnit and how this is the way that unit tests were built in the past for a long, long time. All right, well, today, the state-of-the-art default test runner is XUnit. Now, there are others, of course, but XUnit has templates that are built into Visual Studio, and it just works. You can create a new XUnit project to go alongside your other projects in your solution to do tests. Now, when it comes to Blazor, there's BUnit, and BUnit is built on top of XUnit and also works with NUnit and works with other things. But this is particularly for Blazor components. All right, so you got it? So we went from JUnit to NUnit to XUnit, and now we're Blazor, we have BUnit. Now you can still use XUnit by itself to do unit tests for classes and objects that aren't Blazor components. But if you want to test Blazor components and pages, BUnit is the way to go. BUnit is still in preview, so it's like brandy new. I mean, it's not new, but of course, you know, it's still evolving. So this is a really good time to jump into it. And I'm going to treat this demo as if you've never done any unit testing whatsoever. All right, so let's get started. So I've got a Blazor server project open here, brand new, called Blazor App for Testing. Haven't done anything to it yet, but now we're going to add to the solution an XUnit testing project. So go to Solution, add new project, and you're going to search your templates for XUnit. There's XUnit test project right there. And I'm going to call this Blazor App for Testing Tests. I could call it tests. I could call it whatever I want. Doesn't matter. But just to be clear here, Blazor App for Testing Tests. All right, now the whole idea is to create tests that test your project, test your classes, test your objects, test the inputs and outputs, and make sure that they pass. But BUnit, which we'll get to in a minute, also does tests for Blazor components. So take a look at this project right here. So it's just a class library. So the first thing you might be asking yourself is, well, how do I run the tests that are in here? And how do I tell Visual Studio where the tests are? Well, the way you do that is by running or opening the Test Explorer. And that happens in the Test menu, Test Explorer, or Control-E-T. All right, so there's the Test Explorer, and I've just put it down into the lower pane so it becomes part of my tools. So what happens is you don't actually run this project. You just run the tests from the Test Explorer. And the Test Explorer goes out to your solution and finds all the tests that are in it, and it finds that there's one test here, unit test 1. Now that's just like the boilerplate test here, so I'm going to get rid of that. So we're going to add a couple of tests to test the weather forecast class. And that is here in the data folder. And you can see what it does. When you set the temperature in Celsius, then the temperature in Fahrenheit is calculated with this formula right here. So we're going to add a test to validate this formula right here and to make sure that that's working. So I'm going to go add a class, and it doesn't matter what you call these classes. I'm just going to call this one Weather Forecast Service Test. Now, the first thing you'll notice is, oh, this test project needs to have a reference to the actual Blazor app because that's where the weather forecast is and all that. So we'll go ahead and add a project reference. So this is all NUnit stuff. Fact, okay? This is a test. This is a fact. We're saying the weather forecast at 0 Celsius should be 32 Fahrenheit. So we simply create a new weather forecast and set the temperature Celsius to 0, and we're asserting that the temperature in Fahrenheit is going to be equal to 32, right? And so if it is equal to 32, that test passes. Now, just by having this in here, we don't have to have a class, we don't have to start it, we don't have to run it. Just by having this fact attribute on a method, it's going to be picked up. So let's just click this button over here and run all the tests. And look at that. One passed. If we drill down into here, you can see that this weather forecast 0 should be 32F passed, and therefore this whole class is good and we get green lights all around and everybody's happy. Now let's try to make it fail. Let's make this 33, right? We're going to assert that it's equal to 33 and just run the test again. Yeah, and this time it failed. And it even tells you assert equal failure expected 33, actual 32. So it's telling you why it failed right there. Set it back to 32. Okay, now there's another idea called a theory. And the theory says weather forecast below 0 should be below 32 Fahrenheit. And you pass a value. Now these are the actual values that get passed to this test. And therefore, these become the tests. So there's 1, 2, 3 tests that we've already added to our list of tests. And you can see here now it's saying we're creating a new weather forecast. We're setting the temperature Celsius to the value, and we're asserting that it's true that the temperature in Fahrenheit is below 32. All right, so all of these should pass as well. Now look at this. It already knows that there's 4 tests in this group. 3 of them have not run yet. The last time it ran, 1 failed. So let's run them all again. And now they've all passed. You see that? 4 passed. So let's make one not pass. Let's add an inline data attribute that's greater than 0. So let's make it 3. All right, so now 3 Celsius is another test, and that we're asserting is less than 32, which is going to be false, so that's going to fail. So now we should have 5 tests. 4 will pass, 1 will fail. So let's get rid of that test. Everything runs again. Now, good. So this is standard X unit, right? So you can have one project for all your tests, and you can separate your tests into classes based on what you're testing, right? So this is testing the weather forecast. It's actually not testing the weather forecast service. It's testing the weather forecast. But anything that's related to weather forecast can go in here, and you can add tests to instantiate those objects, set values, retrieve values, and assert that they will be equal to or whatever. You make an assertion on those. All right, this is standard X unit stuff. So let's move on to B unit. Now, this is really cool. I'm going to add two references to NuGet packages. One is bunit web and one is bunit xunit. And both of them are in preview. So now that we've installed bunit, let's do something else. Let's look at the counter page, right? The counter page, of course, has this paragraph and it has a button. And when you click the button, it increments the counter. And then that current count is shown in a paragraph. So let's make a test with bunit to determine that when you click this button, that the current count increments. So for that, I'm going to add a class called counter tests. So you can see we're using xunit and we're using bunit. So the fact comes from xunit. The test context, which is required for bunit, that comes from bunit. So what we're getting is a test context and then a component under test. That's what cut stands for. And we're using the context to render the component counter. Now we have that counter available because we're using Blazor app for testing pages, and that's where counter is. All right, so now this find right here is actually coming from AngleSharp. And AngleSharp is part of this whole stack that allows you to use CSS selectors to find elements on the page and then do things to them. So we have the counter page, that's the component under test, and then we're finding the first instance of a button, and then we're clicking the button. And then we're finding the first instance of a paragraph, a P, and then we're checking to see that the markup matches this string right here, which is current count 1. Now we don't even have to run this as a project. We're not even running the project yet. All we're doing is adding tests. So now we should be up to how many tests? 5 tests. And guess what? They all passed. But if I change this to button 1, well, that's not really a type, so that's going to fail. All right. But what if I wanted to access the button by ID? Well, this string right here is a CSS selector. So you just look up the CSS selector syntax and you can find out all about how to do that. It turns out that if you want to use an ID like this, ID equals my button, that the selector for that is a hashtag. So hashtag my button will find the first instance of an element called my button, and then it will click on it. I mean, this is, if you've done any jQuery, you know all about this, right? So let's see if that works. All right, cool. So that worked. And of course, if I say my button 1, that's gonna fail. Wah, wah. Now there's a way with bunit that you can remove some of the redundant code here. This test context is actually a base class, so we can derive from test context. And now we don't need this at all, this CTX, this context. And therefore, if we just call render component, well, it's in the base class, so it's redundant to do that. So this is a good idea if you're using bunit and you're using C# code to do tests of components. This is the way to do it. Use derive from test context, and then you can just call render component and then all of the other stuff there. Okay? And let's just make sure that everything runs and everybody's happy. Oop, it's not going to run because it's still my button 1. Let's change that. There you go. All right, so now I'm going to build a component from scratch, and we're going to do some tests against that component and make it more and more complex as we go. So let's go to the shared folder and add a new razer component, and we'll call it Hello World. And it's a very, very complex component. Simply says Hello World from Blazor. Okay, now, if we're going to do component testing and do component testing with components, this is another thing we can do with bunit. We need to change the project type for our tests from just a class library to a razer class library by appending razer to the end of the project type. Microsoft.NET SDK razer. Okay, now this becomes a razer class library, and we can add components to it that we can use to do tests with. And this is the power of bunit. So the first thing let's do is add an underscore imports razer component. All right, and I'm just adding to it all the using statements for namespaces we're going to use: bunit, bunit xunit, xunit, the pages folder, the shared folder, angle sharp DOM, everything that we're going to need. So now what we can do is add a component that's going to do the tests, and this will be called Hello World Tests. Okay, so there's some stuff you haven't seen here before. We're inheriting from test component base. Now this first one is a fixture test, and a fixture test does the test with code, right? You have a component under test, which is Hello World, and then we have a code block, and here's our method, Hello World component renders correctly, and we have this fixture that we're passing in here, and we're then getting the component under test from fixture, get component under test Hello World, and we're doing an assert with code that the markup matches Hello World from Blazor. Okay, now this looks a little tedious, and it is, but there's a second way to do tests with bunit, which is snapshot tests. And a snapshot test is much less verbose. Basically, here's your test input, Hello World, and your expected output. You just put the markup right there under expected output. That is so much easier. And there are ways that you can customize this. I'll get into that in a minute. But doesn't this look so much easier than the fixture, where we have to actually write code and spell out with a string the markup? Well, anyway, we've just added a couple of tests to our project, so let's take a look at them and see what we have. We should be up to 7 right now because we just added 2, and look, 7 have passed. All right, so let's make them fail. Let's say we want to check this to Hello Worldy World from Blazor. We want that to fail, and that will fail. Boom. And of course, if we do the same thing down here, change this, then this one will fail. There it is. Remove those and everything works just fine. 7 passed. Okay, so let's complicate Hello World razer a little bit. Let's make it a little more complex. We're going to add a parameter to it called header text. And so the header text will be shown in a h1 header element. And then we'll say Hello World from Blazor right under that. All right, so we're basically adding a parameter. So now how do we test for that? Well, let's modify. Looking at the fixture test, all we have to do is specify that header text equals whatever. Hey now look that our markup matches string is getting more complex, right? To me, this doesn't seem like it's very scalable. Like, I wouldn't want to be plugging in all that markup into that string and dealing with all the problems with strings and quotes and all that yada yada. Look at the snapshot test. Okay. We have our hello world here and our expected output. It's just cleaner. Now, what do you think is going to happen here? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? Idiot?
Don't look at me.
Yeah, one failed. And if we dig into that, hello world tests, razer test, this one right here, HTML comparison failed. And guess why? Because we didn't add the header text parameter on the snapshot test. Okay, now everything should work. All right, so let's continue making our hello world a little more complex. We're going to add a render fragment, child content. So a render fragment, as we've seen before in components, in the building components episode, the render fragment represents HTML, anything that is rendered by a component. And we're calling that child content, and that is a parameter. And so when we instantiate this, what goes between the opening and closing tags for that component is the child content, and that gets rendered. So we're just displaying that below the H2 hello world from Blazor. Now let's change the tests. And let's take a look at the fixture test, right? You see some content here, right, in between the opening and closing hello world tags. And we still have that header text. But now look how complex that markup match string is. It's really kind of complex. And if I scroll over, you can see it all the way there, right? Whereas the snapshot test looks really, really clean, and I can read it and I can understand it, and it makes a lot more sense to me. So snapshot tests are the way to go. And as I said before, we can customize these. We're going to get into that in just a little bit. Okay, let's go back to hello world, and we'll add callback parameters, event callback parameters. So check it out. I've added these two right here, on click and on something. Okay, so when you're making components and you want event callbacks, you want to raise an event to the caller, this is how you do it, with an event callback. So what we can do is we can validate that those things are there with a test. I haven't touched the fixture test here because I'm sort of leaving that one behind. And let's focus on the snapshot test. So all we do is we have an on-click lambda that handles the callback, and the on something lambda, right? We don't actually have to do anything in here for these tests to pass. Woohoo! So no problem there. Okay, now the next thing I want to show you is, what if we want to, instead of passing some content here, pass another component? Well, let's make another component. And we're going to do that in the shared folder here. We're going to add a razer component, and I'm going to call it, quite literally, another component. And all it says is, you guessed it, hello from another component. Okay, so now let's go back to the hello world tests. And we'll update that. All right, so you can see I've added a snapshot test, and I've even got a different description, pass a component as a child content. And so there you go. Rather than having some more content here, I'm just simply saying another component. And now my expected output includes the output from that component, hello from another component. So now I should have 8 that passed. Boom. And of course you can mix and match. You can have static HTML and components, and as long as you have the component output under expected output, everything's going to pass. All right, now let's get into some more advanced testing concepts. And for this, we're going to tackle the fetch data page, right? Here's the fetch data page, which has this weather forecast service, and it shows you some dummy data and all of that stuff. Well, let's go to weather forecast service, and I'm going to create an interface for this service by selecting Control R, Control I. Now we can extract an interface, and it's automatically going to be called iWeather Forecast Service. And if we go there, you can see that all we have is an async or a task of weather forecast array, get forecast to async, right? So our weather forecast service now implements that, and there's a reason for that, because we want to do some mocking. When you have services like this, typically the data comes from a database, and it's going to change from minute to minute, hour to hour, whatever it is. And so you can't count on that data to be the same, so you can't test against the data that's live. So for that, you got to do some mocking. And you can't do mocking without extracting an interface from the objects that you're going to mock. Mocking is basically creating another instance or another class that implements this interface that returns known data so that you can test against it. But it's still the same interface that you're using in production. So as long as your test works, you know that your service is going to work. At least that's the theory. Shut up. So let's move along, shall we? Let's create a component called weather forecasts. So weather forecasts is going to do everything that the fetch data page does, except that it's going to be a component. And instead of injecting a weather forecast service, we're injecting an iWeather forecast service. So that means we can reuse this based on the object that we pass in. So long as it implements that interface, we can use it. Now, before we can use this and change everything to use it, let's go to Startup, where we add the service for weather forecast, and we're going to change it to use the interface. All right, so now instead of adding a weather forecast service by itself, we're using the interface iWeather Forecast Service, and the implementation is weather forecast service. So now let's change fetch data to not use any of this blah, 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 and instead just use our weather forecasts component, just like that. So all that stuff in fetch data got moved to weather forecasts. Let's run this app now and actually see if it'll work like this. Here's my fetch data, seems to work. All right, now we can start thinking about mocks. So mocking is going to be done in the test app, and we'll add a new class called mock weather service. Now, of course, you don't have to create all your own mocks. You can use any mocking framework that you want with XUnit and BUnit. It really doesn't matter. It's up to you. But I'm just showing you fundamentals here, right? If you wanted to create your own mocks and use mocks, this is how mocks work with testing. So here I've got a mock weather service. I'm implementing iWeather Forecast Service. And now I've got this line right here because it is an asynchronous method. And rather than doing some tricks with get result and yada, 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 it's just easier to read if we do this. So I have this await task delay 0 in there just to appease the compiler to show that we are doing something asynchronously. But essentially what we're doing is creating a new weather forecast with a known date right? January 1st, 2021. The summary is cold, the temperature is 0. And then I'm returning the result as an array with one item, that forecast. So let's go to weather forecast service test right here and update it. All right, so you saw we have our first fact here, we have our theory, and now we've got another fact called add weather forecast service. So this is interesting. We're creating a service descriptor of type iWeatherForecastService from mock weather service, and we're adding that to services, which is, part of test context. We're adding that to services. And then we're rendering weather forecasts, the component, and making sure that the service was injected, right? The forecast is not null. And let's test that. Our 9th test has passed. But now let's create a component to test the weather forecast service component. Did I say that right? I think I did. All right, so we're going to add to our test project a new razer component called weather forecast tests. So let's take a look at this. All snapshot tests have a setup which points to a method that passes the snapshot, and there you can add services. So here we're adding a singleton iWeather forecast service, a new mock weather service, just like you would in startup. Okay, there's also a setup async. So if anything that you have to do down here is async, you just change this to async task, and you have all your async code right there. All right, so you have setup and you have setup async, and this is exactly for this purpose where you can register services. Now my test input is weather forecasts, and if you recall, weather forecasts injects iWeather forecast service, right? In our test, we're injecting a mock weather service. And now the expected output is 1/1/2021, 0 Celsius, 32 Fahrenheit, and cold. All right, let's check it out. There you go. Now let's make this test fail. Let's go over to weather forecast and we'll say this here component demonstrates fetching data from a service. And let's try again. Well, that failed. Now check this out. Let's say that this text right here might be different every single time, but I still want to validate the data, right? But I want to ignore this text. Well, you can use this, diff::ignore. And now the test will ignore whatever is in here. So all of the data, all the elements that contain data that are going to change in the component based on whatever, dates, times, numbers, you can change those. So this is a way that you can sort of get around extreme mocking, if you will, right? Your mocking can be simplified to the data that it's going to provide. It's just an option. You can do with it what you want. Let me show you some other things here in the snapshot test, like timeout. Let's add a timeout. So this is saying that if this register weather forecast services takes more than 2 seconds, we're going to time out. So get this. Let's do a setup async. Let's call this async task of register weather forecast service. And here we're going to do an await task delay for 3 seconds to force that timeout. Now let's see what happens. All right, one failed. We know it's going to fail, but let's dive into this and see where it failed. Look at this. Test, and this is for snapshot test 1. Test execution timed out after 2000 milliseconds. All right, cool enough. And if we don't want to call it snapshot test 1, we can say description equals test weather forecast data. All right. Try that again. And now this snapshot test 1 should change to test weather forecast data. So you see that there, and it timed out after 2 seconds. So there's the timeout. Now, you might want to skip this test. That's another thing. We could skip the test altogether, right? First of all, let's go back to it passing. So we have 10 tests that pass. And now we can skip this test and provide a reason. Don't feel like it. And now we should have 9 passed and 1 skipped. So this is just scratching the surface of testing, but I think it's a really good introduction to anyone who wants to start doing unit testing, component testing with Blazor. And next week, we're going to continue on with testing to do some really interesting things. So you don't want to miss that. Back to you in the studio, Carl. So for more information on BUnit, check out the docs at bunit.blazortrain.com. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time. Blazor Train!